Walter was just an ordinary guy who lived an ordinary life as a dock worker. But one day, out of nowhere, his life changed forever. Walter had to figure that out. Eagles typically stayed away from humans and sometimes even attack them. So why were these eagles so nice to him? Well, Walter decided to do something no one had ever done before with wild eagles. They had very sharp beaks and strong wings. He could get hurt with only one wrong move, but he knew this was the only way to figure out what was really going on. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Walter grew up in a small coastal village surrounded by lush greenery and wildlife. And as a child, he was always fascinated by nature and animals. He would spend hours exploring the countryside, observing the various species of birds and other wildlife that lived there. He had a special connection with birds. Their freedom and grace always inspired him. One day, as he was performing his duties, Walter spotted an eagle perched on the edge of the dock. It was an unusual sight, as eagles typically avoid human contact. He decided to approach the bird and offer it some food. The eagle was initially wary, but it soon realized that Walter meant no harm. It cautiously took the piece of meat from his hand and ate it. After he finished the meat, the eagle flew away instantly. Walter was glad he helped the hungry bird and didn't think much of it after that. Walter went home that day with many questions going through his head. He was glad the eagle confided in him, but he worried it wouldn't survive in the wild anymore. The next day he returned to the dock, expecting to see the eagle patiently waiting for him. But to his surprise, the eagle wasn't there anymore. Walter couldn't help but feel disappointed. Then around noon, when Walter was about to go on his lunch break, he heard a familiar sound from above. The eagle had returned, but it wasn't alone this time. A whole group of eagles landed on the dock and looked at Walter with hopeful eyes. Walter was moved by the eagles, so he headed inside and quickly got some meat out of the freezer. When he came back, Walter did something he wasn't proud of. He told the bystanders the eagles were his trained pets and that they were very sick. Even though it wasn't Walter's proudest moment, his plan did work. Some people got scared and kept more distance between themselves and the birds. Walter was finally alone again with the eagles, but his break was almost over. He fed them quickly and expected them to fly away, but they stayed. He quickly got back to his job, but throughout the day, something extraordinary happened. For his plan to work, Walter needed a very small camera, and he had to catch an eagle or get one of them to trust him so he could put the camera around its claw. So after work, Walter went back to the store and bought as much raw meat as he could. Then, he carefully laid all the meat in a little pile in front of him and waited. He sat very still and slowly. The eagles walked his way and began eating the meat. He chose one of the eagles, the one who stood closest to him, and carefully tied the camera around its claw. Then, he slowly stepped back and connected the camera to his phone to see if it worked, and to his excitement, it did. When the eagles finished their second meal of the day, they flew away with their bellies filled. On the camera footage, he hadn't realized it yet, but when he looked at the tracker, he suddenly saw his own address. So he ran outside to see if it was true, and it was. And when they noticed Walter, they dove down and landed in his backyard. Man, how was it possible that these eagles knew where he lived? Walter was now faced with a big dilemma. How was he going to deal with this very strange situation? He was now even less sure that these eagles were following him just because he was feeding them. If that was the case, the eagles were flying in circles above Walter's home. He hadn't realized it yet, and when they noticed Walter, they dove down and landed in his backyard. He was now even less sure that these eagles were following him just because he was feeding them. If that was the case, then they would have most likely just waited for him at the docks, as that was where he was always feeding him. There just had to be something else going on here. And so Walter decided to take some extra measures to protect himself. For the next couple of days, Walter did not leave his house without his loaded Glock, but he did make sure he only loaded it with blanks. He wanted to scare the eagles away and not harm them. He just had to make sure that nobody at work saw him carrying the weapon, as he could easily be fired for it during the following night. The eagles stayed put at Walter's house, and the next day he actually saw them fly with him to work. At the dock, Walter's boss had just about enough of the eagles constantly being in the way and disrupting the busy workflow. Walter had the choice of making sure the eagles left, or he would be fired on the spot. The eagles had to go one way or another. A part of Walter was saddened by this, as he had really bonded with animals during the time period, and it would mean he most likely never finds out why they were here for him in the first place. But another part of Walter also could not help but feel some relief. The next day, Walter made sure that he brought his pistol and even asked his colleagues to take theirs. To get rid of the eagles, the boss made an exception for their carrying firearms rule. With pain in his heart, Walter and his co-workers aimed their guns in the air and started firing blanks. When Walter came home that evening, he immediately noticed that the eagles were not there. The scare tactic had clearly worked wonders, but all Walter could think of was where they were now. So the first thing he did was fire up the tracker again to check. To his surprise, the eagles were actually not that far from him. The tracker seemed to point in the direction of a small house only about a 15-minute drive away from him. Were the eagles now bothering somebody else after it scared them away? Walter knew he should have just left the animals alone, but the man could not control his curiosity. He just had to know what the eagles were doing. He had spent too much time with them to just forget about them the second they were out of his sight. Walter got into his car and drove to the address where the eagle tracker was located. And when he got to the very normal-looking house, he could see the eagles being spread all over it. Who was living here that was attracting these eagles in the same way that he did? She was able to give the explanation Walter had been so desperate for. Apparently, the eagles had first bonded to her late husband, Danny. He had fed the animals nearly every day for about a year, and they were always at their house and his work. But sadly, Danny passed away about 2 weeks ago. The eagles had loyally stayed at the house for a while, even though Danny's wife was no longer feeding them. She had other things on her mind with the death of her husband. Then, suddenly, the eagles were just gone one day. One of them had most likely seen Walter, and the other birds had followed it. And the woman very much understood why this happened. Walter was the spitting image of her late husband, Danny. When she first saw him, she was sure that he had come back to life again. When the woman was past the shock, she explained that she was actually happy that she had the birds back at her house. She had been missing the company and was planning on feeding them daily again so that they would not leave her side. Walter now occasionally comes by to see the birds.